Originally, I was going to review an entirely different game, but for whatever reason, it's something I have to really be in the mood for. And for the week or two I was trying to work with it, I found myself becoming increasingly disinterested in it. I'm not necessarily one to shy away from a game that is trying in the sense that it takes an amount of effort to truly get into it. But at the same time, things were getting a bit chaotic and my headspace was in some dire need of help. As such, I decided that it would be a good idea to cover a game that I like. It's a game that I've enjoyed ever since I was a child, having played the demo for the game for the first time over 20 years ago. But it wasn't until a fair while later that I was able to get a copy of the game, or at least of its follow-up. Anyone remember the Demo 1 disc for the PlayStation 1? Well, as it turns out there were numerous versions of that disc, but the one that I had housed a number of different games on it to play. It included such games as Rage Racer, the third console installment of the Ridge Racer series, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, a cinematic platformer that I wouldn't mind covering at some point here, and Disney's Hercules, which was reasonably fun to play at the time, if only I actually got a copy of the game. There was one game that I got particularly attached to, however. I remember it vividly too. It features you walking along a long platform in the middle of a black abyss. There was no music, only heavy thudding sounds and footsteps, and depending on what you do, it can sound worse than it actually is. Suffice it to say, I have an attachment to this game. I haven't been able to shake it off either, despite going through a period where I forgot what the name of the game was, until I found the Demo 1 disc that I had a few years ago. Saying that, it's not terribly easy to remember the name after not playing the game for so long, given its European name is, frankly, indescript. It translates to painful or distressing, implying a gravely difficult challenge, but it isn't a common word in the English language, hence why I forgot it. That being said, it does sound similar to another Japanese word that is crawling its way into the English language, and not for any good reasons either. But that's not important right now. Let me introduce you to a game I once knew as Kurushi, or, to give it its arguably better and more descriptive name, Intelligent Qube. Intelligent Qube is a 3D action puzzle game developed by G artists and published by Sony Computer Entertainment for the Sony PlayStation. It released in Japan towards the end of January 1997, in America towards the end of September that same year, and finally releasing in Europe under the name Kurushi sometime in October. It is a puzzle game in which you clear waves of multicoloured blocks on a stage in the middle of an empty black void. It's a very simple concept that it almost defies description. Unlike most puzzle games of its time, however, Intelligent Qube didn't have an air of playfulness about itself. It featured orchestral compositions for its music, the visuals were relatively ordinary in appearance, and it wasn't a colourful and bouncy experience. It was serious. Because of how ordinary the game appeared to be on the outside, expectations by reviewers of the time were not very high, but it turned out to be a lot more entertaining than what the game first suggested, finding the gameplay loop to be entertaining and addictive. Criticisms were levied against the game's graphics, however, as it was decidedly simple, even for what the PlayStation was capable of, and yet it had a few technical issues that limited its presentation somewhat. However, that didn't prevent Intelligent Qube from selling almost 750,000 copies towards the end of 1997 in Japan alone. This was a solidly successful game over there, and although you'd be hard pressed to find many people who remember it with much enthusiasm, unlike me, it clearly has its place among some of the similarly successful games on the system. So now that we have some of the minor details of this game out of the way, how about we start to look into what we have? So let's begin with the packaging, starting with a slight diversion towards the American box art. North America would see Intelligent Qube release with a box art featuring a character standing on a large space with cubes coming towards him and collapsing behind him, trying to assess what the next course of action should be. You may notice that the cover is really grey. With the exception of the green cubes, the majority of what you see is black, white, or some monochromatic grey in between. Suffice it to say, it's not exactly the kind of box art that entirely catches the eye. However, it's arguably more of an eye catch compared to what Japan and Europe got. Whether you play Intelligent Qube or Kurushi, the cover art will be a good Homolocene projection of a globe, but instead of countries, it's some form of text. The Japanese box art has the letters IQ inside the globe that has been rolled out, as well as the name Intelligent Qube written underneath it. However, you may notice that it has a white border around it with a PlayStation The Best logo at the top. For the uninitiated, PlayStation The Best encompassed a collection of games that were very successful. There are similar programs worldwide with America's Greatest Hits and Europe's Platinum lines. If it's anything like Greatest Hits, PlayStation The Best titles sold 150,000 copies at least in their lifetime before classification, or 250,000 copies after an increase to the limit, and were priced at a much reduced cost compared to the original. So in essence, you're seeing me cover a budget version of a very popular game in Japan. It would also explain why another logo appears here and there, but don't worry about that for the time being. There isn't much we've got to work with on the front, so let's have a look at the back to see a few descriptive images. There's the one that looks very close to the US cover art, but does have a few differences, as well as an array of screenshots below it, with a small bit of text below. In a way, I actually like how this is all presented, but I can definitely see how someone might be tempted to put the case down after picking it up, since it doesn't really do much to try and sell the game to you. To be honest though, I don't think it really has to. After all, it sold 750,000 copies in Japan across the year of its release. It clearly did something right, and given this was 1997, there would have been plenty of games to choose from. Maybe the marketing push in the West could have been a little better instead. But now we have a look inside this box, which consists of the game disc, the front cover slip, and the manual, which is reasonably thick and contains quite an extensive degree of information, which is impressive given the rather simple nature of the game. There are a number of images in this game's manual, so it may help in determining what you can gather from this manual, but it's all in Japanese anyway, so you may struggle to understand what is written in it. With that being said, the game does have a few pointers within itself to explain how to play the game, but we won't be going into those. Just know that it is better able to show how to play the game with in-game explanations and demonstrations without the need to worry about reading Japanese. And now I shall shut up briefly and stick this game into the PS1. The game's introduction is pretty straightforward, a rather jovial FMV sequence of a globe in its Homolocene form being reformed into a sphere, with the character's IQ forming on the globe, followed by the game's name being written below it, before a cheeky rewrite of the C to become a Q. Next up, we are thrown into a menu in which we have 4 options: 1p, 2p, rule, and option. 1p is the one we're after, so on we go to seeing what is behind this whole thing.
First stage.
This is where I go over the rules of the game, as this applies across the entire game. The objective of this game is to clear waves of approaching cubes by either capturing them or allowing them to fall off the end of the stage. To do this, we press the circle button to mark a tile on the floor. Pressing the circle button again clears the mark, and if a cube is on the mark as you clear it, it will capture the cube and eliminate it from play. Surely this sounds too simple to have a game made out of it. Yes, well, here comes the jeopardy in all this. There are 3 different kinds of cubes in this game. You'll have cubes that are the same colour as the environment, the normal cubes. These cubes are vital in that they need to be eliminated in order to score the highest number of points. What you don't want to eliminate, however, are the forbidden cubes. The forbidden cubes are solid black cubes which, if captured, will wipe out an entire row of the stage. I'll touch on this mechanic in a moment. The third and final cube type is the advantage cube. Glowing green if one is captured, it can place a mark of its own on the tile it was captured on. That mark can be operated as a bomb with the triangle button, capturing every cube in a 3x3 area around that mark. There is a trick with this that I will mention as we go along, but firstly, I mentioned something about a row of the stage collapsing. That's because in this game, your job is to make efficient use of the cubes and maximise how many you eliminate at a time, whilst avoiding the forbidden cubes. Capturing a forbidden cube will remove a row from the stage on which you are standing. There are 2 other ways in which you can lose rows. The first way is by allowing normal cubes and advantage cubes to fall off the stage, which get counted in the bottom right. For every normal and advantage cube that falls, 1 mark goes against that tally, and if you allow more cubes than the tally to fall, you'll lose a row of the stage. The final way to lose rows of the stage? By being crushed under the cubes as they move towards you. This can happen if you don't pay attention to where you are, and if it happens, every cube that falls off the stage, normal, advantage or forbidden, gets counted to the tally, and if you're only partway through a wave of cubes, you'll have to do that same pattern again. This adds a layer of peril to the game because you can get a game over quite simply by falling off the edge of the stage. If you trap yourself and make the game harder for yourself, it's very probable you can make it impossible to win, as it snowballs easily if you can't get it back under control as quickly as possible. Thankfully, however, there is a way in which you can lengthen the stage. For each section of cubes that come your way, if you clear all the normal and advantage cubes, whilst leaving the forbidden cubes to fall off the stage, the game congratulates you for doing a good job. In other words, the more rows you acquire, the better your chances at clearing each section of a given wave, as it gives you a little more breathing space than otherwise. Each wave is broken up into either 2 or 3 sections depending on the nature of the stage and how wide it is, and each stage features 4 waves, each one regenerating as the last one is completed and the stage progresses. Clearing a stage at the end gives you a bonus score depending on the number of rows of the stage you still have, so there is an incentive to do as well as you can to get the best scores possible. It also gives you a moment's respite from the pressure this game can exude at times. After you clear a stage, you are sent after a few seconds into the next stage, this time with a different aesthetic, different music, and an increase in challenge compared to the previous stage. This is the part where I start to go over some of the more challenging aspects of this game and how one can best approach this game for the first time. Firstly, one part of the user interface that I have not mentioned yet is the par number in the top right of the screen. For each section of a wave of cubes, you have a different par number of rolls denoted by the denominator. The numerator above it begins to tick down once you capture a cube, and it increases for each roll the cubes make on the stage, until all normal and advantage cubes have been captured. Provided you didn't allow any normal or advantage cubes to roll off the stage or capture a forbidden cube, you will score bonus points depending on how many rolls it took you to clear the section compared against the par number, with more points awarded for using fewer rolls than the par number. I mentioned earlier how you can use a few tricks to your advantage, and the first one I will cover is in relation to the advantage cubes. When captured, each one leaves a green mark on the ground, and if the triangle button is pressed, it detonates everything that encircles them and captures them. But what if there is a pesky little forbidden cube in the way? Well, you can't capture that, otherwise you'll forfeit a row of your stage. Well, there is one thing you can do. Place a mark on the tile that you want a forbidden cube to be located when you want to activate the advantage cube's marks. If the tile is in an area that would have been captured by the advantage cube, it keeps the cube on that tile as it is, and doesn't capture it, making it a perfect safety net for when you need to clear out numerous cubes, despite the unwelcome presence of a forbidden cube. Another technique you can perform with the marks is much harder to pull off, to a point where even I struggle to do it consistently, because it requires very good timing and agility. Any mistake and you could very easily get pulverised. Place a mark on a tile you want to capture a cube on, and run towards where you want to set your next mark. Just as the cube you're aiming for begins to roll onto your mark, trigger it, and set your next mark where the next cube will land, and run before getting crushed. You can use this to cut down on how many rolls you take to complete each section, and go below par if done right. If done wrong, however, you can find yourself overwhelmed or capturing the wrong cubes. You can even dodge the forbidden cubes if you need to get out of an emergency situation by finding a diagonal space between 2 forbidden cubes. There are a lot of options for progress afforded to the player here, which, for a puzzle game this simple, is pretty great. In a way, I'm reminded of Panel Upon in terms of how it can utilise a simple concept, such as manipulating blocks, and making a lot out of it at the first time of asking. Okay, I may have gotten a little bit ahead of myself there. Intelligent Qube doesn't have that much content if I were to be completely objective about it. The difference between this game and Panel d'Upon is that Panel d'Upon had a focus of making as much as possible out of as little as possible, hence the various game modes that it has on offer. In comparison to Panel d'Upon, Intelligent Qube doesn't offer a great deal. It has a 1-player mode and a 2-player versus mode, and that's largely it. No set puzzle mode, no endless mode, no time attack, nothing. The only gameplay affecting things in the 1-player mode is the speed at which the cubes roll towards you. This didn't exactly hurt the game's performance in Japan since the game was still very successful for the time, but it was decidedly bare bones for what it was, with limited ways in which you can play the game. That doesn't mean to say, however, that the game is bereft of things to do. The game is still solidly replayable in order to get the best scores available to you, which, given this is a puzzle game about being as efficient as possible, is a good way to make it replayable. And in fairness, reaching the final stage in a playthrough is always a reasonably fun challenge. Instead of getting 2 or 3 sections in a wave, you get one massive tsunami of cubes that you have to deal with, but there's a kicker. You have to remember where you've placed your marks and where you've captured advantage cubes, because there is no cursor above them anymore. You have to play by feel, and it's such a good change of pace for a final challenge. It also drives home the feeling of being locked into a difficult environment. Of course, I can see why some may not like this change this late into the game, but I don't mind an extra curveball like that. Beating the game unlocks a new game mode of a sort, however. If you go into the options menu and select game mode, you can press left or right to switch between game modes between normal or original. What this does is nothing at first, but if you start up a 1-player game, it brings you right into a screen where you can make your own puzzles. Set a size, make silly shapes, and make a puzzle that you probably shouldn't solve, and boom, you've got yourself a whole field of forbidden cubes. Except this feature doesn't extend beyond purely being a novelty. It's functionally like the normal mode, but with a complicated menu at the start. So if you make a larger level that goes towards the end of the game, you're waiting a while to be able to play it. There were a few other things in the option menu, however. One of them is Player, which allows you to pick from a selection of 1 avatar as you start out. His name's Elliot. There are 2 other avatars that unlock as you beat the game. Beat it the first time and you unlock Cherry, who has a red dress. She's also a little faster apparently, but I cannot confirm it. Play as Cherry, beat the game and get an IQ score of 400 or more, and you access the goodest boy known as Spike. To be honest, there isn't really all that much of a benefit to playing these different avatars. There may be some speed increase, but I really can't perceive it in normal play, and I tend to treat this simply as a different skin more than anything else. The other thing of immediate interest in the options menu is the game mode. We've already mentioned this when we talked about the original mode, but there's also levels. The footage you're seeing right now is me trying to play level 4. It's surprisingly playable, and if I wanted to, I could probably get pretty far into the game. But in all honesty, this is a little excessive for me. At the very least, your IQ score should be higher based on the level you played at. Oh yeah, IQ score. I should explain this. The game has 2 score systems. The one you'll see throughout the game, and the IQ score at the end. You can find the specifics for it as others have done the research, but to cut a long story short, you'll find that the IQ score is comprised of a fraction of a percent of your sum total up at the end of each stage. At the end of each run, your IQ score takes priority in terms of value. It's a little complicated under the hood, but it functions as the game's basis for optimal play, especially later on in the game, where it has the highest effect on your eventual IQ score. Of course, there is one more option in the options menu to affect the texture set for the normal cubes in a given gameplay session. Immediately there is a problem of not being able to see what exactly the textures on the cubes are, but that's not the worst of it.
First stage.
These texture sets beyond the first one are categorically ugly. Maybe I'm just used to how the standard set looks, but I do genuinely think some of the textures in these sets look shocking. Especially since you end up with some that make the game really difficult to play for one reason or another. Some of these textures have very little contrast with the other cubes, making them a little harder to differentiate between, which is especially concerning when you consider how antithetical it is to this game's concept of efficiency and minimising mistakes. I will say with regards to this game's graphics that they exist pretty much just to get the job done. There's no pretense of making a game look amazing or to push the capabilities of the hardware, it's just to get the game to look like it belongs on a PlayStation. To that end, it succeeds for the most part. The cubes, on the base texture set that is, are readily identifiable and easy to make out, and you usually don't worry about making mistakes such as failing to identify cubes properly. Usually the mistakes are from brain fade, not from the game screwing you over. On top of that, the game also aims for 60 frames per second, which is pretty cool. Not a lot of polygonal 3D games on the PlayStation can boast that it hits 60 frames per second, yet it manages to hit that for quite an amount of time from the limited testing that I've done. With that being said, the game still doesn't look amazing. The avatars have a very low polygon count, and cubes are very simple shapes for the game to render. The problem is the game seems to be very weird with how it renders things, because it's still quite imperfect. There are occasional glitches, such as your legs being hidden when a new wave of cubes form from underneath, and sometimes you'll cause the game to slow down a bit during the later levels, because despite the simple unimpressive geometry, the game still has to render enough to cause some slowdown. It also doesn't help that after getting a second successful run in the bag, by the skin of my teeth, the game had a weird moment where it kind of froze and sent the game's user interface and cube textures into mild disarray. It was kind of surreal. But that's enough bad about this game's presentation. We're going to talk about the good now, and that is going to start with the same visual thread, only this time I'll be talking positively about the user interface. This game has a very straightforward user interface that doesn't intrude on what's going on in front of you. It tells you what stage you're on, which wave you're on, how many points you've scored, what the par number is for the section of cubes, and how many non-forbidden cubes have made their way beyond the precipice. I really quite like this interface because it doesn't get in the way, but it also tells you so much stuff at any one time without overloading you. I like user interfaces that tell you a lot whilst using very little screen space. The only downside really is that I can't seem to make this look as good as it can probably be through the OSSC. For whatever reason, the vertical lines on the wave boxes don't want to play ball with the OSSC, hence why they look a little weird. They'd probably look better with a different line multiplier like the RetroTink. And finally, we should talk about the audio in this game, and I will start out with the sound effects. Had this game just had the sound effects alone and not the music, this could have been a pretty stressful game, perhaps even bordering on survival horror at times. The cubes sound very heavy, like something you really don't want to be near, in case they land on top of you or, for the sake of imagination, they cause a massive earthquake or something. It's really quite impressive. The sound of your footsteps as well permeate and cut through any empty space between the cubes and the music. They're loud and they sound strong without getting irritating. It's great, although I do wish running back to the cubes didn't cause the choir in the background when you get a row back to shut up. On that note, I ought to talk about the fact that this game has voice work. The game has a few voice actors, some of which are more easily found than others, and in general the voice work is there mostly just to get the job done and expand the game a little. One notable voice actor here is Joji Nakata, a prolific and accomplished voice actor whose repertoire included being the voice of Kazuya Mishima in Tekken 1 and 2, Baohu in Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, and Alucard in Hellsing.
Perfect the water.
Another one is, I assume, the guy who shouts every time you get a new row. His name is Barry Jurdy, and if you're a big Resident Evil fan or just happen to watch a particular video by Justin Wang on the matter, you'll discover that Barry was once the voice actor for Resident Evil's Barry Burton.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Of course, it's not the only role he's performed in the booth. He's done a fair few things, such as Red from Mega Man X7, as well as a few adverts, but Barry Burton!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Something tells me that I should probably move on to the music now. The music in this game was composed by Takayuki Hattori, the third generation in a family rich in music history, with father Katsuhisa Hattori having worked with Takayuki to create the first orchestrated arrangement of Final Fantasy music along with Nobuo Uematsu, as well as grandfather Ryoichi Hattori, who apparently created a boom in popularity for jazz music in Japan after World War II. Takayuki Hattori's works prior to this included the soundtrack to the anime Martian successor Nadeshiko, and a number of movies in the Slayers franchise, so he certainly had some ability behind him. And by all accounts, the music here is pretty damn great. There isn't a great amount of music, just a handful of tracks on the soundtrack, but the quality of these files alone makes them pretty great. It's proper CD quality, and you can tell immediately it is some good stuff. For some specifics, it was quite unusual to have a puzzle game featuring orchestral music. I can imagine it was done before this game, but this was certainly one of the first truly notable uses of that music. The nature of the music as well gives the game a special sort of atmosphere. Had the game not had music, like the demo version that I played as a child didn't, the game would have been eerie and creepy, but it wouldn't quite have that bite, the tension that drives the horror home. The music has this sort of comfortable, jovial air to it at first, like it's easing you in. But as you get further, you find yourself listening to tracks that are a little disconcerting, particularly the one encountered on the 3rd and 7th stages. There's just something about that track's quietness that makes it quite spooky, honestly. And that's not even the best of it, because this game's music has one last ace up its sleeve. The game knows when you have very little space to work with, when you've made enough mistakes to put yourself in serious jeopardy, and it will let you know in no uncertain terms. The music gets very tense, panic-inducing, and pretty damn scary. You're locking horns with a bunch of cubes. That shouldn't sound scary, but against all reasonable logic, it works. Suffice it to say, I think the soundtrack is excellent. In fact, it ended up being released as its own CD a few years after this game's release, along with the soundtrack of the game which follows this one, so why don't we take a look at that game for a few minutes? The game which followed Intelligent Qube was called IQ Final, or Kurushi Final Mental Blocks in Europe. It's worth noting now that although Intelligent Qube saw a release internationally, IQ Final only made its way from Japan to Europe, with Intelligent Qube being the only release in the series in America. Developed by Sugar and Rockets and consisting of many of the original developers for Intelligent Qube, IQ Final was designed to expand Intelligent Qube's gameplay style, featuring new gameplay modes and some of the toughest challenges yet. First things first, the introduction is quite a lot nicer. It's not as animated and it takes longer as a result, but I get more of an eerie aura from it. Not to mention, I just like how it makes clever use of the Earth's landmass to make the game's name. The main menu is also very different. The options menu doesn't appear on the front, instead you first select what game mode you want to play before accessing the options within that menu. The IQ Final mode is the same game as before, but with a few changes which we'll go over. For a start, it's 3 waves of cubes instead of 4, and the base speed is ever so slightly slower, but the game moves at a generally brisker pace and feels a lot smoother to play as a result. Moving the section of cubes along is quicker, the game feels more responsive, and it's generally a lot nicer to play. The game also runs at 60 frames per second, just like Intelligent Qube before it, but it doesn't feel quite as hampered in the same way. There was an unpolished roughness to how Intelligent Qube processed what was going on, something that is smoothed out here. Also, prior to starting your game, you get a much more illustrative options menu, complete with the ability to see what types of textures you can apply to the cubes, so you can see exactly why you should stick with the base set. The original textures are the best, just use those, don't bother with the others. As for the other game modes, my comparison to Panel de Pont is rather appropriate now, as it now includes an endless mode in the form of survival, a puzzle mode in the form of 100 attack, and a slightly more fleshed out create function that I didn't really bother checking because why would I? Survival puts you on a stage of your own choosing, and you simply get wave after wave of cubes which increase in speed after a set number of waves, and you get a visual indication of the stage's length to the right hand side. I had a slight issue however. I was too good at stage 1, to a point where gameplay lasted for almost an hour and a half. I actively had to shut my brain off and sabotage my play session just to end it, and it feels weird to have to do that. 100 Attack is the game's puzzle mode where you are thrust into eliminating cubes in as optimal a way as you can, requiring that you be on par at least. It can be a decent way to learn some of the patterns of cube sections, so it's got that going for it. For me, however, the big draw was IQ Tectonics. Accessed after beating a decent part of the game, you are given a gauntlet of 20 puzzles to solve, all 9x10 in size, with no respite. Errors are exaggerated here, as you don't have a tremendous amount of space to work with normally, and you need to make use of everything as smoothly and error-free as possible, which I tend to struggle with. When I was a little younger, I focused too much on perfecting it before even getting to a point where I'd beaten it and gotten the experience under my belt. Now that I've taken my time with it and actually beaten it instead of just trying to be perfect out of the gate, it's a little less intimidating, but still a great challenge. There's also a greater variety of characters to play as, and many more voice actors involved, including the likes of Peter Barakan, an English-born broadcaster based in Japan, also known for handling the publicity and even wrote some lyrics for the famed electronic group Yellow Magic Orchestra. There is also Robert Belgrade, the voice actor behind Alucard in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and was also the voice of the announcer in Tekken and Tekken 2. That talk of Georgie Nakata is starting to sound a little bit like deja vu. And once again, Takayuki Hattori's soundtrack blends in well with the game's tone. It doesn't have the quieter piece that Intelligent Qube did, but it does have a couple truly great pieces of music that drive home the tension and make you feel like stuff needs to be done quickly. So on the whole, IQ Final is a truly worthy successor to Intelligent Qube and is a game that I would consider the embodiment of an ideal sequel. It takes lessons learned from the original game and uses it to better itself technically, visually and sonically. So where could it go from here? For the release of the PlayStation 2 in 2000, there were a fair few titles that tended to sell the system short for one reason or another, be it the relatively mild bump in graphical quality compared to Sega's Dreamcast, or not really taking much advantage of its newly accrued hype. Although not among the launch lineup, the third installment in the Intelligent Qube series, IQ Remix Plus, would launch just weeks into the PlayStation 2's life, exclusively in Japan, and it is a marked departure in quite a few ways. The presentation is the most obvious change, and not just visually either. The sweeping orchestral soundtrack is replaced with some admittedly cool electronic beats. This isn't a particularly offensive change to me, as the tracklist does at least have some quality, and there are a few callbacks to previous games with audio samples of voice lines from IQ Final included. It's pretty alright, to be honest. What I find a bit more irritating, however, is how there's a relative lack of gameplay modes on offer compared to IQ Final, or at least that's how it feels to me. In reality, it's only missing the create mode and tectonics, but it feels a bit watered down in some respects. I guess it feels watered down because Sugar and Rockets figured it was a great idea to make the survival mode the primary gameplay setting, but merged it with the standard Intelligent Qube format. As a result, you complete 2 waves of cube sections, followed by a maze in which you may have to eliminate cubes in order to progress through the maze, as well as a massive forbidden cube wall that requires you to squeeze through a hole in it before you move on to the next stage. Once you have beaten the 9-wide stage, you'll return to the 5-wide stage, but this time it will be faster, and the more times you complete this process, the faster it will get, reaching a point where it gets impossibly fast. I'm not on board with the idea of merging the standard Intelligent Qube format with the survival mode. Although it maintains the 2-player compatibility, it does still feel like the game cuts back on certain features to try and make others seem impressive when it felt a little old hat by this point. And similarly with regards to content, you don't get to change your character outside of playing as player 2 in the IQ Remix Plus mode. It's pretty disappointing, to be honest, and feels like it lacks a lot of the personality that Intelligent Qube and IQ Final had. I'm also not fond of the visuals either. This is a game that looks to have been designed with the use of a suggestion box filled with ideas that were all implemented with no care given to whether or not the ideas themselves were good. There are so many visual effects employed at any moment, it feels like if Industrial Light and Magic were told to make a game with no restraints on what they could do. It feels so distracting and noisy that it actually detracts from the game. I feel like I can hear the visuals more than the music in the background. I get there's only so much you can do with a bunch of cubes and a player model, but maybe weather effects could have worked? Or maybe some animated textures for stuff like the advantage cubes could have gone an awful long way. But instead we get all the colours mashed together to form brown. In summation, this is a game I would probably have recommended in isolation, but it's a marked backward step in the series across the board. It doesn't feel particularly nice to play, honestly, so I would recommend skipping it unless you really wanted a copy of IQ Remix Plus. From here the series went silent, until a PlayStation Portable game called IQ Mania released at a budget price in Japan exclusively in 2006. I don't imagine it made much of an impact given the little information I found about the game. And that's basically your lot for Intelligent Qube as a series. There's only so much you can do with a concept like this, although I do think that there is some stuff left on the table. Just imagine if Sony decided they wanted to do a Tetris 99 style Battle Royale game but with Intelligent Qube. That'd be cool. Alas, I do not expect it to happen anytime soon. The most recent game in the series released over 15 years ago, and most people have likely forgotten about this game in lieu of a lot of other PlayStation classics that released contemporaneous to this. But in spite of that, what we have here is a game that serves as a pretty good foundation for what I would consider to be one of the best puzzle games I've ever played. Although Intelligent Qube is where it started, I believe IQ Final was the game that perfected its style of puzzle. That said, both games have their respective merits, and a lot of the merits cross over each game. It just happens to be that IQ Final is a more refined and polished version of Intelligent Qube. In the end, if you wanted to play one of these versions, I'd recommend IQ Final. The language requirements are very forgiving for these games. With a bit of logic and feel, you can get through this game with little to no need for a tutorial. Although the rules section of these respective games do give you a visual demonstration of what you can and cannot do. As such, you do not need to understand Japanese in order to be able to play these games, as a majority of what goes on is self-explanatory and easy to get to grips with. Importability is also pretty good for the free titles that I have mentioned. A lot of copies of Intelligent Qube are floating around and are easily available for prices in the region of £10 over here, or on Yahoo Auctions. You can expect to pay about the equivalent of a meal deal here. Genuinely, copies of Intelligent Qube are so common that they are cheaper than a sandwich, a bag of crisps and a bottle of pop. It's a bit more expensive over here, but the majority of that is just import expenses, and in any event, it still works out cheaper than the PAL version of the game here. I went into a city for the first time in over a year to find that CEX had a copy of Karushi available for £30. Which is honestly a bit much for me for the kind of game that it is. It's good, for sure, but I don't think it's £30 worth of game. There are many more games on the PlayStation that fit that category. There is another option for those who want to get the game, but don't want to buy a physical copy of the game. Intelligent Qube is available on the PlayStation Classic. Granted, the PlayStation Classic has a plethora of problems such as inconsistent emulation, problems with the audio, a weird mishmash of PAL and NTSC releases, and other issues, but this is one of the ways in which you can play Intelligent Qube. A quick search on YouTube revealed a fair few people who are only just discovering this title for the first time, which is at least one positive for the PlayStation Classic. Maybe it could actually have had other things that made it actually good. So, in conclusion, Intelligent Qube is a really good game. It's a game that I would urge anyone who loves puzzle games to try out, especially those who missed out on it during the PlayStation's heyday. It's a surprisingly fun and invigorating challenge, and I'm sure there will be some fun to have with this. If you had to push me on which version to get the PS1 games primarily, but if you can only get one, let it be IQ Final. Although Intelligent Qube itself is great, IQ Final refines it into a game I would genuinely put alongside many of the great franchises the PlayStation birthed. And I say this without any exaggeration. Just don't bother with IQ Remix Plus, unless you like the music enough to actually want to play the game in order to listen to it. It's not a great follow-up, and it's one of the many disappointing PlayStation 2 games that made the launch of the system as lukewarm as it was. If you have any thoughts on what I ought to cover next, let me know in the comments below what you think I should do in the near future. You can also head to my website where I have a list of all of the imported games I currently have in my possession, and you can also head to my Twitter to keep up to date with anything I'm up to. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sadi.